Good evening. Thank you for being here so that I am talking to a group of lovely faces as opposed to a bunch of empty chairs. I want to start by thanking the Shift Lab as well as the Edmonton Community Foundation for making this event possible and for inviting me to be here with you tonight. I've been asked to share with you what I've learned about engaging in conversations about race, and I'm sure actually many of you are here this evening because you've already had your own long journeys on this subject, and many of you undoubtedly have important insights that you could be sharing up here as well. For you, I invite you to consider how my experience may be similar or different than your own, and that, how your experiences may have led you to similar or different conclusions or perspectives. But if this room is like most others, then there are plenty of people here who are, particularly white people, that are filled with some anxiety and fear, trepidation about talking about race, and I want to get a sense of how many people are willing to take the risk to raise their hands and admit to fear or anxiety, concern. Thank you. I appreciate that. I understand that. And tonight I hope to offer some of what has helped me transform my apprehensive feelings into a sense of personal investment. And to do that, I need to tell you how I was brought up. And I need to make sure I can use. There we go. So my parents, they're both white. They worked as middle-class civil servants throughout my life, a nurse and a police officer. They raised me in a predominantly white community in Southern California in a fairly conservative suburb of Orange County, which is about an hour south of Los Angeles. They are egalitarian-minded people, which is to say that they taught me that everyone is equal and that I should treat everyone the way I want to be treated. I never heard a racial slur in my home, and anyone from any background that I ever brought home was warmly received. They never talked about race, though. My teachers also never talked about race, except for one who said that she didn't care if we were white, yellow, red, green, or purple. My coaches were silent on the subject, and so were the textbooks that I read in school. The void around the subject of race meant that I grew up without any real knowledge of the truth of race and my country's vast history of racism. I learned only what the TV and movies offered, and of course, what other kids around me might have said. And thus, the ideas and the conclusions that my young mind formed about race were never questioned or discussed. It was not until I was an adult that I was asked to consider how race had shaped my life, my sense of myself, and how it was affecting my actions as a teacher, working mostly with African American and Latinx students. Here I was, 25-year-old woman with 2 advanced university degrees, having this conversation for the very first time. I was confused, intimidated, offended, defensive, and frustrated. I was, to use a very useful term, racially illiterate. And what I mean by racially illiterate is that my education hadn't prepared me to understand, interpret, or talk about racialized experiences. I hadn't developed a personal relationship to my racial identity because society had not required it of me. And this left me at a complete loss when people of color around me started talking about me, my racism, and how the way I worked with the students was problematic. The best analogy to explain the experience is that the people of color in my life were trying to discuss algebra with me, and I was still at the stage of learning subtraction and addition. How was I supposed to have an intelligent conversation about algebra when I only knew basic arithmetic? Well, it was a complete mismatch. And of course, I didn't realize it at the time, and that was a real problem. I'd had a lot of formal education, including a course in multicultural psychology, and I'd had plenty of cross-race experiences. I was a sprinter on both my high school and my college's track teams, and I was used to being the only white person in the room. There had been plenty of moments where I heard my teammates lament the racism around them. I was used to that. What I wasn't used to was being personally challenged. It was unnerving to be told that I was unconscious to an entire aspect of my life, and it was really hard to accept. And so I resisted. And I argued with my primary mentor, a man of color that I had a real crush on. I'll be completely honest, I don't believe I would have stayed in the conversation as long as I did, except for the fact that I really wanted him to like me. So I stayed in that emotional upheaval for quite some time, and I was, without question, experiencing what Robin DiAngelo calls white fragility. It refers to the way many white people react to the experience of racial stress. And this stress occurred as I was, for the very first time, being called to see myself as a white person who was doing damage. And I responded in many of the same ways that Dr. DiAngelo writes about in her book. I reacted badly because it felt like my identity as a good and decent person, a worthwhile person, was being threatened. And it wasn't, but it felt that way. Even though I knew the people of color around me were only trying to help me become a teacher that was better for the kids, it challenged my conception of myself as racially innocent. Above it all, out of the fray, not part of the complexities of race. Well, several years later, a lot of conversation later, I left that school and I entered a doctoral program. And the research study that I chose for my dissertation allowed me to explore a much deeper understanding of who I am as a racial being and what that means for my cross-race relationships and how to engage with people in a much more productive way. The dissertation eventually became a book called Witnessing Whiteness, and it's because of that book that I was invited to be with you here tonight. I wrote it because it doesn't make any sense for people to have to go through the protracted experience that I did, feeling too much guilt and confusion and too little time effectively taking action in service of racial equity. I figured that if I could provide stories and information that would allow others to bypass some of what I went through, that would help us collectively move much farther, much faster. So tonight, I'm going to share with you some of what I found most useful and important when it comes to conversations about race. And to do this, I'll highlight 4 primary areas of concern. The first is building authentic relationships across race. Second is adopting what I call a both-and mindset. Third is thinking systemically. And the fourth is building a practice around one's anti-racism. One caveat is that as I tell my story, I will likely use the pronouns we and us quite a bit. I do that when I'm talking directly to white people. I may say that we do something, and I appeal to those of us who need to do a certain kind of work. For the people of color in the room, I do hope that this talk ends up being useful to you in some way. Just please keep in mind that I can't stand here and not spend a significant amount of time speaking directly to white people about what we need to do. So, on to the first area of concern, the need to build authentic relationships across race. Most of us want our relationships to be deep and meaningful, and yet white people often have trouble successfully crossing the racial divide. A big part of this is how we respond to getting woke, as they say. What most white people do when we first get either personally challenged or woken up to the damaging impacts of racism is that we look around for how to fix things. We don't want to be perceived as part of the problem, and so we scramble to try to figure out, what do we do? And at this stage, we usually have a pretty naive and superficial understanding of what that's going to take. And so, in the search for direction, we often turn to the people of color in our lives, if there are any. And depending on the quality and the length of those relationships, we might find willing and open ears. Just as likely, though, is that we're told to take responsibility for our own learning and go find someone else to talk with, preferably another white person. Once we do find someone who knows something about all of this, the most typical question we ask is, can't you give me something that just tells me what to say or do? I mean, if you just told me what to say, I would say it. If you just told me what to do, I would do it. And so let's be clear, what we are asking for when we do this is something like a top 10 list. And I want to ask another question to see how vulnerable you're willing to be. How many of you have wanted this list? Raise your hands. How many of you have gotten that list? Okay. So the thing is, there are some general statements that can be made, and there are a lot of lists. A Google search will bring up a number of them, and here's one, by net impact on how to have a meaningful conversation about race. You just read that. Approach the conversation with respect. Fantastic. Put aside your preconceptions, examine your motivation, embrace the discomfort of not knowing. Find out what you don't know. Listen. Be open to questions. Internalize what you've learned. Commit yourself to change. Acknowledge your privilege. And get comfortable with your story. These are all great suggestions. And the paragraphs on the website that give context to each of them, they're also very helpful. You can find this with a very quick Google search. This was the first thing that came up. At the same time, in our day-to-day lived realities, exactly how to implement this list is not completely obvious. Or at least following it is no guarantee that you'll avoid criticism or that you'll stop annoying or offending a person of color. For example, number 1, approach the conversation with respect. Great. What exactly does that look like? Ask different people from different backgrounds what it means to be treated respectfully, and you are likely to get many different answers. How about committing yourself to change? What kind of change? How much change? Different people are going to have different interpretations of what this means as well. How about acknowledge your privilege? Great. Now, what if that's a confusing topic to you? Does that mean you should avoid conversations about race until you learn all the various ways you're privileged? Let's look at another list. This one is one that I created, and it includes suggestions I have heard offered quite a lot to white people. Accept that your impact is more important than your intent. Take responsibility for learning about race and racism. Don't rely on people of color. White women should not cry in multicultural dialogue groups. It's not personal. Avoid making the conversation all about you. Speak up when you see racism in action. Be accountable for your words and actions. Resolve your guilt and shame. And pay attention to intersectionality. What do you think of this list? Which ones seem relatively straightforward? Which ones seem like they would need an explanation? Maybe some deep kind of internal process or skill development. Which ones are just about learning to do the right thing versus learning how someone else prefers for you to engage with them or engage with people around them? For white people trying to become racially literate, there are so many questions that a list like this can't answer. And I'll tell you why that will always be true. It's because dealing with race is still algebra. And if we want to select the best possible responses, we need higher level skills than a simple list can provide. We also have to keep in mind that race conversations happen between individual people who have unique histories, preferences, and expectations. A list will never tell you how to best engage with another unique being. They can help, but they aren't enough. So let's consider what happens when a lot of people, in a fairly short period of time, wake up to racial injustice, and we rely on these sorts of lists for guidance. Well, I recently had a conversation with a graduate student in a social work program. And this individual was deeply frustrated because the school has adopted a mission statement that is explicitly anti-racist, which sounds great. Problem is that a set of guidelines for how to behave are being handed out to students. They are superficially understood, which isn't surprising, and they are being interpreted as rules. This is leading to more tension on campus. Instead of supporting the creation of authentic relationships, the guidelines appear to be undermining them. Why? Let's consider the suggestion that white people need to take responsibility for learning about race and racism. don't rely on people of color. I stand by that. It is a good suggestion. Unfortunately, a superficial understanding can lead to an interpretation of that message as, don't ever talk to people of color about race. And that's what's happening. So let's consider this suggestion more closely. It says to take responsibility to avoid relying on people of color. It doesn't say you can't ask a person of color if they're open to providing you with feedback. It doesn't mean you can't invite a person of color to have a conversation about race with you, letting them know you're interested in their point of view. It's simply highlighting that for too long, white people have expected people of color to do the heavy lifting, to be our primary instructors. And we haven't been cognizant of this request as a burden, taking time and emotional energy. And this is why I'm starting with the idea that what we need to do is be sure that regardless of whatever list that we're working from, that we try to enact these suggestions within authentic relationships. So to highlight my point, it's how we enact the suggestion that makes the difference. We need to take our own steps to do our own work. Yes, we should be learning from all of the books and the podcasts and the documentaries and the affinity group conversations and all the other avenues that we have available to learn about the horrors of racism, how it's operating in our current society, and how we, as white people, are privileged. And we can invite the people of color in our lives to let us know what they experience with us, if they're interested in doing so. And if they're interested, great. And if not, then we move on, satisfied with what might feel like a rejection, because people of color are not responsible for teaching us. And I'd like to tell you why I feel really strongly about this. It's because my first, perhaps most awkward attempt to consciously and extremely self-consciously expand my circle of friends occurred while I was teaching 5th grade. I had been recently challenged about having only relationships with men of color. Why wasn't I forming relationships with the women of color at the school? I wasn't sure what was going on, but I looked around at the school where I was teaching. I was one of 3 white women on a faculty of about 40. There was one woman of color that I saw often enough, and she seemed nice. I respected her. She didn't hang out in the teacher's lounge talking a lot of smack about the kids, and she also said important things in faculty meetings. She seemed like someone I'd want to get to know. So one day, after our weekly staff meeting, I approached her, and I told her how I'd recently been challenged. And I asked her if she might be willing to talk with me and get to know me. She told me years later that she laughed at herself, and she thought, yeah, I can help out this poor little white girl. And that was about 20 years ago. That's Aisha, and she's currently one of my best friends. I would have missed out on so much if I hadn't approached her as a human being. But it didn't need to go that way. I recall another moment when I was putting together a multiracial dialogue group for women. I asked a woman of color to join who I'd met at a conference. She said no, and told me in no uncertain terms that projects like this were not useful to people like her, and so I went away. But about 2 years later, I approached her again to ask her if she'd be a participant in my dissertation study. It was a totally different kind of project. She allowed me to come to her home, give her my pitch, and it turned out that my study dovetailed with something she was interested in working on herself. So she said yes. But before I left her house that day, she stopped me and she asked why I'd come back. I asked what she meant. And she said most people would have been angry and intimidated when she rejected my earlier invitation. And she said she was glad I returned, but that it was unusual. And that's part of the problem. White people can become so self-conscious when we begin to look seriously at race issues that we make 2 profound errors a lot of the time. First, we are so worried about making a mistake and offending someone that we take everything extremely personally and feel rejected the minute we get a piece of critical feedback. Second, our self-consciousness causes us to forget that people of color are both people of color who shouldn't be expected to teach us and individuals who are capable of making their own decisions about whether or not they want to be in conversation with us. Building authentic relationships means that we never forget that for as much as we need to be conscious of race, we also need to remember that we're talking to another unique human being. My experience has led me to believe that there are a few key things that we can do to help this. And so now I'm going to give you a top 5 list. This is what to do when engaging in conversations across race. Lead with your vulnerability. It's okay to say that you're nervous about asking a question. It's okay to say that these conversations are new to you. And it's often disarming, and a lot of people are really quite generous. Second, avoid making assumptions. It's okay to ask if someone is willing to be in conversation with you. Just don't expect it, and if you're told to take a hike, don't take it personally. Number 3, respect limits. Assume that trust will be built slowly over time. Most people of color are understandably suspicious about white people's investment in doing the hard work of learning algebra. Number 4, accept that you will receive criticism. You will offend people. You will feel misunderstood, and try to interpret moments of criticism as a chance to learn what that individual giving you feedback needs or wants from you in the future. And then finally, maintain a healthy sense of self. If you are going to hear things that you don't like, and it's going to be important that you create a sense of self that holds you up during those moments of challenge. And that's where we're headed next. So, the second theme I'd like to highlight is the usefulness of adopting a both-and mindset. There are 4 different aspects to talk about here. First, both-and mindset helps me because it helps me accept that there are some unresolvable tensions that we experience when dealing with race. Second, it helps me receive critique. Third, it helps me engage more effectively with people in conversations about race. And then fourth, it helps me appreciate people working toward racial justice in different ways. In terms of the acceptance of unresolvable tensions, let me start by saying that most of us are conditioned into ways of thinking best characterized as either or. It's infused in our language in all sorts of subtle ways that we're often not even aware of. An example would be this exchange. This is an urgent problem and we need to take action immediately. But we need a bigger vision so that we can make the right choices of what to do. In this way of thinking, if one statement is right, then the other must be wrong. The word but plays an important role in this. The word but acts as a block, and it inspires feelings of constriction and tension. A both-and mindset allows for a completely different experience. It holds open the possibility that 2 seemingly opposed things can both be true. It allows for contradiction. Both-and thinking sounds more like, this is an urgent problem and we need to take action immediately, and we need a bigger vision so that we can make the right choices of what to do. Holding that both-and mindset inspires imagination and the idea that potential solutions might exist. And I know this may sound rather simplistic. I mean, all I've done is I changed one word. But what I've noticed is that with a both-and mindset, it's easier to accept the complexity of race issues and that some tensions will simply always be present. For example, holding a both-and mindset allows me to say each of the following things without feeling internally compromised. I'm a good person, and I'm complicit with racism. I'm an individual trying to act in an anti-racist way, and what I represent as a white person means that I am unlikely to be trusted by people of color who don't already know me well. I need to focus on systemic change, and I need to learn more about how implicit bias causes me to act out microaggressions. And I work against racism in some way almost every single day. And I enact privileged behavior I still don't recognize, and I'm complicit in upholding systemic racism since the institutions I interact with are basically set up to privilege me. All of these statements are true, all at the same time. Being able to hold all of this in balance provides a foundation that keeps me upright when I feel internally conflicted, or confused or critiqued, because it allows me to accept the existence for these unresolvable tensions. And that leads me to the second way I found the both and mindset to be valuable. Like many people, I don't naturally take critique well. It's common that when hearing a challenging idea for the first time, I tend to disagree with about 95% of what is said. And this pattern is not very productive, and I realize that. What I found, though, is that if the conscious intent is to search for the both and between myself and a person giving me feedback, it allows me to stay in the conversation until I can find a connecting link. Honestly, I don't generally express my initial inner resistance, so this is more of an inner process. This is the inner work I do. Yet holding that both and intent is often what helps me locate the truth in what that person is giving me in terms of feedback, even if my life experience says it's all different. So third, I have also found that the both and mindset is extremely useful when talking to other people who disagree with me about how racism is infused in our society, and I will say that this is true both when I'm talking to other white people or people of color. I used to use the word but all the time in conversations. Somebody would say something, and then I'd say, but you know, or, you know, but on the other hand. And using the both and approach instead has allowed conversations to go from being adversarial to having a far more open tone. This is important because if I'm going to be influential, I need to be able to stay connected and invite people in and avoid pushing them away. In practical terms, a lot of my conversations end up sounding like, yes, I'm also concerned about, and I find something I can connect to that the person has said, as minute as it might be, and added to that, and then I'm going to add something from a more anti-racist perspective. So it sounds like I'm building, not that I'm taking away. And the thing is, I'm not just uncritically agreeing with everything that's being said, nor am I driving the entire conversation. I'm finding a connection and then adding something generative. Now, this use of yes and did not happen right away. For quite some time, like I think about 2 years, the but just came out of my mouth before I even had a chance to stop it. So I spent a lot of time internally recognizing and taking note of my missed opportunities and telling myself, okay, I'm going to try it the next time. I'm going to get better the next time. So it's been a lot of practice later. And at this point, I almost never use the word but when engaging in conversations about race. I can't even express how much of a difference this has actually made for me. And just so you know, the use of the words yet and however do the same thing. It really is a mindset. It really is an overall approach. And it is one that takes practice. With both and, the whole point is to try to appreciate complexity and find something that you can agree with in what that other person has said, or what that person values, or who that person is, something that allows you to make a connection, and then complicate it with something you also know to be true from a more anti-racist perspective. And then finally, the fourth way a both and mindset has been helpful is the way it helps me value the diversity of strategies that happen in the fight for racial justice, as well as all of the other people in all of the other positions along this journey. So here's where that metaphor comes in. I think of it like this. This is LA. Imagine a freeway with many lanes. We have a high occupancy vehicle lane. It's the carpool lane. That's to the farthest left. And then we have a fast lane. Then we've got our middle lanes, and then we've got the slow lane to the farthest right. There are on-ramps and off-ramps about every half mile where I live. Now, let's imagine this as a racial justice freeway. Everyone on the freeway is trying to get somewhere farther down the road toward racial justice. The carpool lane allows people to go faster if they share a ride. This is where the people who are activists hang out. They're connected with the various racial justice organizations in operation in our cities and our countries. The fast lane right next to it, this is where the radicals hang out when they're not in the carpool lane. and a sense of urgency is present in this lane, and action to change the systems is of absolute utmost importance. The middle lanes are used by a number of us who generally are up to speed, sometimes taking action and moving into the fast lane, while other times slowing a little bit, letting others go by, focusing on making steady progress with others around us. The strategies used within these lanes vary. People educate or agitate or activate on any given day in different ways. The slow lane is where we get started. Introductory resources, workshops cater to these folks to help us get up to speed when we're just entering the freeway. Strategies used by those of us in the slow lane often involve just starting a conversation that challenges racial stereotypes with white colleagues or family or friends. These might be our very first steps into anti-racism, and it can feel huge and risky when our skills are newly being developed. The point of this analogy is that no matter where we are on the freeway, the important part is that we are on the freeway and that we keep moving in the direction of justice. All the lanes have value. Being in the fast lane does not actually guarantee success, and being in the slow lane does not indicate a lack of progress. The slow lane may not seem to be moving quickly, but it is where a lot of movement is taking place that can eventually pay off down the road. Also, working to get up to speed is important. We want to keep learning and stretching ourselves so that we can merge into the faster lanes when we're ready, freeing up space in the slow lanes for new people who've just entered. And let's not forget, changing lanes takes skill. It's important to avoid cutting people off, either by rushing too quickly to enter the fast lanes, or by being hypercritical of people in the slower lanes. There's a lot more that can be said using this analogy. I'll stop there though, just in order to quickly review how overall I think this both and mindset is useful and how I think it helps affect the way we talk about race. First, a both and mindset allows us to retain a positive sense of self when we are acknowledging our ongoing complicity with racism. It allows us to stay open and keep learning, especially when we're feeling challenged by critical feedback. It allows us to maintain connections with those we seek to influence, especially during such polarized times as we're living in today. And finally, a both and mindset allows us to appreciate and value everyone who's invested in racial justice, regardless of where they're positioned. So, now we're on to number 3. Third theme I'd like to highlight is the need to think systemically. So it took me a really long time to understand this issue, and I think I know why. People called me into conversations about race by questioning me both about my lack of relationships with women of color and how I was interacting with students of color. Although it began a deep journey of self-reflection, it's one that I now realize was way too narrowly focused. A set of resources from Race Forward, Race in the Media, helps shine a light on something that I should have realized much earlier, but I didn't. It explains that there are 4 different types of racism, and each is essential, and I'd only been paying attention to 2 of the 4. So, the first of the 4 types is interpersonal. Intrapersonal. This is the internalized, unconscious, or implicit bias that lives within us. It's the private beliefs and prejudices we have about different racial groups. Internalized bias can reside underneath our conscious layers, but it surfaces in our thoughts and our speech and our actions in ways that we might not even realize. For me, my implicit bias comes out, for example, if I make assumptions about a student's socioeconomic status or life experience or immigration status. Then second, there's the interpersonal. This is where our biases play out between individuals during our interactions. It can be conscious or unconscious. One person may act in a way that harms another person, and the person doing the damage might not even know that they're behaving in an offensive or damaging way. And this is often what happens when microaggressions occur. The third is focused on institutional racism. This is where systems of power are involved. The rationale for these systems may appear neutral. However, the enactment of the policies and the practices leave room for bias to pervade the operation top to bottom and result in discriminatory results. Examples include bias in an organization's norms or hiring or promotional practices, pretty much anywhere up and down the hierarchy. And finally, there's structural racism. This is the broadest type, and it crosses over institutions and society as a whole. This is the cumulative, compounding effect of the entire array of societal factors that include history and culture, ideology, and interactions of our institutions and policies that result in systematic discrimination. At this level of analysis, we're not talking about any single individual's choices, as much as an entire complex nest of factors that collectively leads to one group being disadvantaged in the aggregate. So this framework is important to know about because it helps us understand that if we only focus on the internalized racism or the interpersonal dynamics, we're never going to be truly addressing how racism is maintained. I recently heard an interview with Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, author of Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. He says that when it comes to racism, we're getting it all wrong. He argues that racism isn't alive and well because people are ignorant, and that we're creating and maintaining unjust systems because of a lack of awareness. Instead, he argues that racism is alive and well because racist systems were set in place that benefited some people over others. Theories about racial differences were then created to justify those racist systems and their outcomes. So it's the systems themselves and the differential outcomes they cause that prompt and maintain people's current racist ideology. Let me say that again, it's a lot. Racist ideology is alive and well because we have racist systems that continually produce racially differential outcomes, and those outcomes are used to justify racist ideology. And therefore, the only way to eliminate the racist ideology is to disrupt and change the systems. And in this way, I'm something of a cautionary tale. I spent years primarily concerned with how I could get along better with people, and then how to help other people get along better with other people. What I now understand clearly is that if we truly want to end racism, we need to put a strong emphasis on changing structures and policies and organizational norms so that they lead to equitable outcomes. So how does this offer guidance in terms of us and our ability to talk about race? Well, it does so in a few ways. First, if I try to engage a conversation about race with a person of color who is thoroughly aware of how systemic racism operates, and all I care about is us getting along better together, I should not be surprised if that person thinks I've missed the boat and wants very little to do with me. Second, when we take the systemic nature of racism seriously, we become more intentional about trying to help other people recognize it as well. Sonia Nieto's work has been something of a guide for me recently. She wrote about the skill sets that people use when using language to express their understanding of the world. Translating her work into what happens with white people, there are 5 different ways that white people understand and approach race. An essential key is noticing that an individualistic lens is used in 3 categories in terms of how people interpret how the world works, while 2 of them use a systemic lens. The individualistic approaches include positions of indifference, distancing, inclusion. In all of these 3 positions, white people tend to interpret what happens in the world as being related to individuals and their personal choices. The focus is on personal responsibility, and here racism may be acknowledged as being a problem in general, but it's a problem that resides only within individuals. That changes when we get to the second set. This is where systemic lens is used to interpret the world. The systemic lens includes these positions of awareness and allyship, and the focus here is on how racism works within systems and how that affects people's lives. So what struck me about Sonia Nieto's work is that the movement from the individualistic lens to the systemic lens is acknowledged to be a huge and formidable step. A lifetime of conditioning has made us masters at interpreting the world through an individualistic lens. Once we begin to interpret the world systemically, though, it's often overwhelming. And while we're using awareness skills, it takes a lot of emotional energy to stay in this position. And I can think of two reasons why this would be true. First, everything and everyone else in our life might be tugging at us to return to the individualistic lens. The media, politicians, our family, and our friends, the majority of them will continue to offer reinforcements that the individualistic interpretation is the more accurate one. And in this way, interpreting the world systemically is completely countercultural within our spheres. Second, a systemic view of the world is emotionally upsetting because it offers a vision of the world that is so radically different than most of us grew up receiving from our family and our friends that it can seem like pulling the rug out from under everything we've known to be true, if we take it seriously. So let's consider what's happening today. In the last few years, many people have experienced a huge wake-up call, having been influenced, whether it's by the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States or recent efforts working for justice with First Nations people here in Canada. Those who just become aware of the depth of these injustices are primed for conversations that help them learn to use a systemic lens. But it's essential that we provide the emotional supports necessary to help people resist the pull to return to the more individualistic positions. So how do we do that? Well, there's one thing I haven't yet mentioned that concerns me greatly. I've seen a lot of recently woke people being really, really happy about railing against others. You know, those racist people over there. Whether it be police, public figures, or someone that's uplifted in the media who's saying horrible things. However, too often there is a huge pushback against seeing how each of us is complicit with racism in our own lives. So how can we help white people recognize our role within oppressive systems? Well, what I am about to offer you is something of a backdoor approach. It's the sort of strategy you might use because you know about white fragility and the desire to feel racially innocent, and you want to undercut the defensiveness in order to advocate for the value of a new perspective. What I have personally found extremely useful is to make sure that I place the blame outside of that individual. I blame society for the racial illiteracy I experienced. I blame an education system that failed to educate my own teachers about racism, which led to me and my community being misled. I blame the entire historical record for conditioning me and all the white people that I love and respect to ignore the way our privileges injure people of color. And I talk about how upsetting it was to learn that I had been lied to and how it reflected generations of lies. And then, with a great sense of joy and hopefulness, I talk about my sense of disappointment and anger and how it has been transformed into a deep feeling of responsibility to help others avoid being misled in the same way that I have, and how fantastic and wonderful it is to be aware of what's really going on so that I get to be a part of changing things for the better for all of us. Not for other people, for all of us, because I don't want to live in a community that's dealing with racism any more than you do, right? Right? And the reason this approach is so effective is that it allows white people a sense of self as a decent person to be preserved. I'm not asking people to feel guilty or shameful for a history that they didn't create. I'm not asking them to reject their loved ones. We've all been duped, and it's our job to support each other to wake up from the stupor and learn about the injustice. So, there are 3 metaphors that are often used in this effort to disarm that defensiveness and help people recognize how they're potentially connected to the 4 types of racism. And so I'm going to offer you these 3. A simple one is from Dr. Kendi. He describes societal racism as rain that comes down on us every day. He says something to the effect of, you can't stand in the rain for very long without getting wet yourself. Getting wet with racism is inevitable, no matter how hard we try to protect ourselves. Another one is from Jay Smooth, a biracial hip-hop video blogger, awesome for kids, by the way, who suggests that we adopt a dental hygiene model to talk about racism. He says most white people think of racism like tonsillitis. Either you have it or you don't. Either or. And once you are not racist, you don't need to be on your guard, but we're constantly being hit by racist messages every day. And unless, oops, let's go back. There we go. And unless we keep fighting against it, it's going to make us more and more racist over time. And so racism is much more like dental hygiene, something you have to work at every single day. So instead of focusing on someone being racist, like you have tonsillitis, we can talk about racism more like, hey, I see there's some racism in your teeth. You know, I get that in my teeth sometimes. The idea is to avoid labeling who is or who is not a racist, which simply does not help the conversation. And the 3rd metaphor is the one I've personally used the most. I learned it from Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, the author of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And she says that we are all like fish in a fishbowl, swimming in water that's permeated by racism. The racism in our environment was set in place long before any of us were born, and it conditions us. We don't see that water in the fishbowl. It conditions us without our consent and without our awareness. So I find no shame in admitting that I've been conditioned into racism. Of course racism is infused in me. Of course racism is in the systems I'm a part of. It's in the water. The ability to acknowledge this frees me up. Instead of spending energy being defensive, I can spend energy learning how the system operates and how to help change the water. Including this perspective as I tell my story to other white people has proved tremendously helpful in helping me pull them in to conversations that they otherwise would have rejected. So, all of what I've said here this evening so far is hopefully providing maybe a few new insights. However, it will only be meaningful if it becomes an active part of a practice. So let me ask, has anyone had the experience of going to some kind of event like this, maybe a conference, where you hear something like really insightful, learn something new, and you make this mental note that you are never going to be the same again, you're going to use that thing as soon as you get home, and it's going to change this whole thing in your life? Raise your hand. How many of you had that experience? Now, how many of you have gotten home and realized, wait, what? I don't know how to do that thing. Or you put the thing away and 4 months later you go, oh yeah, what was that about again? How many? Raise your hand, be honest. Yeah. So the final topic I would like to address tonight is the need for us to create a practice around our anti-racism. More questions. How many of you played sports when you were a young person? Aha. Keep your hands up. How many of you were part of a theater or dance troupe, any sort of thing? Put your hands up. Add to the mix. How many of you played music, an instrument? Aha. Yeah. How many of you needed to practice to get good at those things? Hands down. Yeah. The thing is, most of us have lived lives where we've come to understand the value of practice. If we want to become good at something, if we want to gain a skill, we need to practice. Somehow, we don't approach race the same way. Most of us have the idea that as long as we're consciously opposed to racism, that somehow we will automatically translate that into us being able to do and say what's needed in the moment. It doesn't work that way. What I'm going to suggest now are a set of 4 elements that I think need to be part of a conscious practice of anti-racism. This isn't an exhaustive list of what's important, and quite frankly, it's not rocket science either. I have found, though, that it offers a framework for how to get started in a systematic way that allows for at least a well-rounded approach, I think. So, first, we need to build our knowledge base. The fact of the matter is that we are not going to be able to influence people to take racism seriously by appealing to their empathy or their emotions. We need to know what we're talking about. There are a whole host of categories of knowledge that I think we need to consider. And my suggestion is that you keep something like this list available and choose learning material that relates to the full variety of topics, like one by one by one. Don't just focus only on one, make it an array, because if we want to be well-rounded, we need to know all of this stuff. We need to know the history of racism and white supremacy. We also need to know the history of resistance to racism and white supremacy. That's the way we get to say, hey, look, we're not starting this for the first time. There have always been white people working against this. We need to stand on those giants too. We need to understand white privilege and white racial identity and how to build an anti-racist practice. We also need to look at our own roots, our cultural histories. What was going on before assimilation happened? Right? How did our assimilation process mean that we bought into privilege but then let go of some roots that could be more grounding than simple whiteness? And we need to understand the intersections of race and class and gender and sexual orientation and ability and all the various things that makes life much more complicated. That's one. Second, we need to build our skills. When we're engaged with conversations about race, what are the strategies we can use? Just as it's essential that we have a base of knowledge to draw on, we need a practice set of engagement strategies that help us carry the conversation forward, or that help to interrupt something that's going on around us. Making it awkward for a person saying or doing something racist, that is a great strategy. And then exactly how to implement that in any given context, that may actually not be obvious. Role plays amongst a group of people to practice is helpful. This is something that I engage with regularly. I'm not just making this up for you. This is actually useful. Third, not that one yet. We need to build our personal capacity to engage. This aspect is really about ensuring that we are in a healthy process of racial identity development. The research is absolutely clear. If we are not in a healthy place, we tend to lash out at other people, or silence ourselves, or otherwise end up with emotions subverting our intentions somehow. Connecting with a process that allows us to articulate a personal stake in the work is essential. Why are you yourselves invested in anti-racism? How is it about you? Not about somebody else. It's about you as a person who cares about this subject. Why? Have to understand how to name that. It's liberating. It reduces fear. It reduces the anxiety. It provides a strong foundation upon which to stand when called to action, and it motivates people to come want to be part of our party. We need to offer people a good reason to want to come be part of this. And fourth, and finally, we need to build a community of practice. And this community is where we build our knowledge, our skills, and our emotional capacities to get ready for action. I am exceedingly fortunate that I was able to access a nascent community back in Los Angeles in 2003 that invited white anti-racist people to start doing this work together. We support and educate one another so we don't put the burden on people of color. We have one work group available for the inner work that we each need to do in order to build our knowledge and our skills and a healthy approach to our development. We also have a work group that's action-focused, and that group works in solidarity with people of color organizations towards systemic policy changes. I know that I'm fortunate to have this available in my community, but it's not a secret how it was developed. In fact, myself and my Aware LA colleagues have created a toolkit of resources. It's all on the web and anyone can download it and use it. It includes all of our theoretical documents, our reflections on lessons learned after 15 years, and our nuts and bolts documents for how to actually run meetings. We've got agenda, templates, and everything for you. It's extremely comprehensive, and we are willing to help support you one-on-one if you want to start something like this in your own community. And if that feels like too much, too quick, then there are other ways to get started. A lot of people start with something like a book group amongst a set of friends or concerned colleagues, whether at your organization or school or in a neighbor's house. A book group using a curriculum series designed to help you create shared understanding of race and your personal relationship to it can be really useful. Witnessing Whiteness, the curriculum resources are free. They're all online, just download them. And a lot of groups have been using it for the last 8 years. It's not a new book. I co-created the curriculum series with a multiracial team of reviewers so that they could use it in their own organization, and it's spread. Several groups have started with Witnessing Whiteness first to get that shared language and base, and then they've moved into an Aware LA model, which is a little bit more intensive, I would say, afterwards. But the reason that all of this, the curriculum series and the products are free, is because Aware LA has taught me that grassroots organizing, where leadership is grown from the ground up within one's group, to help create a solid foundation for long-term sustainability. You grow your own voice within your community so you don't need constant stream of expert speakers at a very high rate of pay, I might add. Grow your own. There are wonderful people here who will, this is what happened for me. I was able to create my voice just by doing the work on the ground with Aware LA. And then there's 2 other resources I want to just highlight, and then I'll finish up. The first is a brand new curriculum series that goes along with the newest book, Living in the Tension. Whereas the Witnessing Whiteness series is meant to be implemented in a linear fashion without skipping chapters, it's very much a personal progression of racial identity for people to go through. This new one is a lot more flexible, I would say, just because I don't know the variety of folks in the room. It's perfect for like yoga communities who've not yet figured out how to deal with issues of cultural appropriation, or more progressive spiritual communities who are struggling to create consensus around how to accept demands of First Nations groups. Or also for activist groups who are actually struggling because it's so hard and fast political that you're actually losing the humanity of the folks that you're trying to serve. And then there's one other. I didn't create this one, but I love it. It's called the White Ally Toolkit. It's a workbook that is specifically designed to help white people prepare for conversations on race with their loved ones. It's got great module sets that are literally like help you go through question by question, preparing for different kinds of conversations. It doesn't necessarily treat the fullness of the practice, but it's certainly a piece of what I think would be a good starting place for some people. And so to wrap this up tonight, I want to acknowledge how daunting all of this can feel. And I think I've said a lot here tonight, so I want to do just a quick review to highlight the key points. First, while the desire to search for simple answers to hard questions about engaging in cross-race conversations is understandable, we should remember that whatever list or guidance we're given, we're interacting with another human being, and learning what each individual wants and expects from us is essential if we want to build authentic cross-race relationships. Second, working to shift out of an either-or mindset and replacing it with a both-and approach can help us live in the tensions we face critique, engage with others, and appreciate all those on the racial justice freeway with us. Third, keeping the 4 different types of racism in mind will help us recall that we need to think systemically in order to work toward ending racism. This means we need to take action to change the systems that reproduce differential outcomes for people of color. And finally, there is no way around it. We need to develop a practice. This will take time and attention, and it is work that we must do. And doing it within a community is what will make it sustainable. So one last thing I'd like to say as we move forward on this racial justice freeway, let us construct as many on-ramps as possible, appreciate all of us who are in our various lanes, and watch out for one another, be guided by each other, and let's help keep it moving. Thank you very much.